Hello, and thank you for coming along. Tonight we're going to look at fossil fuel corporations and how they're continuing to deceive the world with the assistance of corrupted politicians and regulatory agencies. The regulatory agencies are the ones that are supposed to keep track of the truth claims of the industries and regulate them to serve the public interest. The budget finance committees of both the Senate and the House have launched a new joint investigation into Donald Trump's quid pro quo offer to Big Oil. Just in the last few weeks, there's been an extraordinary move on the part of a troubled former president. Jamie Raskin from the House of Representatives has joined Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from the Senate to look into these questions of the lying from Big Oil. They've issued a report, a joint staff report in April 2024, just at the end of that month. It was entitled Denial, Disinformation, and Doublespeak, Big Oil's Evolving Efforts to Avoid Accountability for Climate Change. In a letter they both wrote to Merrick Garland, Attorney General, at the end of May, on the 22nd, they asked the Attorney General to look into the crimes that they feel are substantiated by the evidence that their committees uncovered. As they argue, our investigation into the fossil fuel industry calls to mind the historic congressional investigation into deceptive practices of the tobacco industry and its trade associations, which led to investigations and litigation by several state attorneys general and the Department of Justice. They go on to point out that Big Oil's deception campaign evolved from explicit denial of the basic science underlying climate change to deception, disinformation, and doublespeak. Speaking before the House, Representative Raskin underscored that the congressional report finds Big Oil lied about efforts to fight climate change. How did they do this? Well, they concluded that companies including BP, Exxon, Mobil, Shell, and Chevron led campaigns to deny climate change science. Then they portrayed natural gas as climate friendly, which it is not, of course. Then they pledged to support the Paris Agreement and a net zero emissions policy while intentionally avoiding it, and internally making that very clear in memos to the senior executives of these organizations. Further, they obstructed and delayed committee investigations wherever possible. And they relied on trade associations to spread the lies. This was the pattern of their deception and deceit and denial. Let's have a look.
In Congress, the top Democrats on two committees are asking the Department of Justice to launch a sweeping investigation of big oil corporations. They allege that the companies have deceived the public for decades about their complicity in climate change and willingness to address it. Our Lisa Desjardins has more.
Senate Budget Chairman Sheldon Whitehouse and Congressman Jamie Raskin, the top Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, are asking for the kind of action that DOJ brought against tobacco companies about 20 years ago. but against big oil. This comes weeks after the two released a joint staff report laying out their findings from a 3-year investigation of major oil companies. And Congressman Raskin joins me now from Capitol Hill. Congressman, you're talking about evidence that more than 50 years ago, big oil companies knew about fossil fuels' connection to climate change. And then you're also talking about more modern evidence that they've been deceiving the public. Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. 50 or 60 years ago, they clearly understood that the burning of fossil fuels destabilized the climate and warmed the earth. And they made a very deliberate decision that rather than tell government and blow the whistle, they would try to suppress that evidence. And they suppressed the evidence, and then as other scientists and other places began to discover the relationship between fossil fuel combustion and increase in the Earth's temperature and climate change, they denied it, and they tried to throw a blanket of uncertainty and confusion over the whole subject. And even after climate change became a well-accepted and well-acknowledged reality throughout the world of science, they have done whatever they can to try to undermine us making the policy decisions we need to make in order to break from the carbon economy and the carbon model and move to solar energy and wind energy and renewable systems. So we have very specific evidence of them taking all of those steps, and it goes on even to this day. So we had lots of evidence of it, and we want to turn it over to the Department of Justice. Congress obviously has to work on solutions going forward, as we did in the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. But we want to make sure that this history is not swept under the rug.
Right. We want to make sure that this history is not swept under the rug. Well, it's a very powerful report and clear statement by both parties. Take a look.
A new congressional report finds that big oil is still a big liar. The 66-page report accuses companies like BP, ExxonMobil, and Chevron of using disinformation and doublespeak to lie about their efforts to fight climate change.
Fossil fuel companies publicly claim to be partners, if not leaders, in fashioning climate solutions, but our investigation exposed that as a fraud. Big oil is not addressing the climate crisis, but profiting from it. The era of denial and deceit must come to an end.
Joining us now, the man who you just heard, Democratic Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. Also with us, Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. Senator Whitehouse is the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, which held today's hearing. So, Senator, I will begin with you. Explain what you found.
What we found is that the well-known campaign of the big oil companies to deny climate change, to treat it as a hoax, to question the science, all of that nonsense has morphed into a new campaign in which they pretend they care about climate change, but when you look under the hood and get into their documents, you can see that they are set up to oppose reaching the Paris climate goals, set up to try to lock in natural gas forever, and in a whole variety of ways depart from what their public-facing statements are.
How are they doing that exactly, Congressman Raskin? What are they saying, and where are they saying it?
Well, we reviewed millions of pages of documents that were discovered by the House Oversight Committee Democrats, and there are lots of different techniques that they're using. Some of it is they will, in public, say they support, for example, the Paris Climate Accord, and then behind the scenes, they will say, well, we don't really have to do anything to move towards complying with the Paris Climate Accords and doing our part. They will run, just endless amounts of TV commercials about algae as a potential solution to our climate crisis.
spending half as much money on ads as they actually spend on investing in algae research, then they pull up the stakes on the whole enterprise and just let it go. But meantime, you've got millions of people who think they've got some great new algae breakthrough. Meantime, they're not really doing anything to break from the carbon model, which is, a dagger at the throat of humanity at this point. We know the renewable energy systems that they should be investing in today, but they're not doing that.
Big Oil senator has said that this is a bunch of politics in an election year. How does Congress plan to hold them accountable? What can Congress do?
Well, a lot depends on what the voters do. For one thing, we can keep the heat on them, as we did today in bicameral fashion, and put the pressure on the fact that they still are lying and they still are faking it and they still are trying to obstruct climate progress. But if the voters will let Congressman Raskin back into the majority and leave us in our majority, then we can go back to work for another really big climate bill like the Inflation Reduction Act, which has been really well received around the country.
Well, that is a big ask it's an ask of voters, certainly, especially in the Senate, where the chances of maintaining the majority don't look so great in terms of the map right now. That's just the facts of the situation. But if you
look at the candidates, that changes.
Well, let me ask you about that. When you're talking about this issue specifically, what are the candidates saying to voters, and do you believe that this is a top of mind issue? Does it supersede abortion? Does it supersede the economy? Does it supersede the protests that we're seeing on college campuses?
It depends on who you're talking to, but particularly with young voters, it is essential. And there is enormous popular support for getting something done on climate. If there's something immediate on the news, if it bleeds, it leads, then that is going to capture the public's attention in that moment. But if you look at where people's long-term concerns are, the things that really drive them, climate is in the top 3 or 4 every single time.
How do you get at this, though, Congressman Raskin, when you're talking about campaign finance? A lot of these companies spend a lot of money to keep a lot of your colleagues in their seats.
Yeah, this came up at the hearing today. People understand that we've got to defend our democracy and our voting rights and our freedom so we can deal with this mammoth crisis, which is really a civilizational emergency. There's a lot of campaign money that comes in from the carbon kings, and some of it goes directly to candidates, some of it goes into independent expenditures, some of it goes to think tanks, some of it goes to universities and academic research projects. Our report lays it all out so people can understand it. People need to know where it's coming from if we're going to break from the carbon model and move into a new period of renewable energy sufficiency, which is what we need.
We certainly do, and it'll be a challenge in the next electoral process to get that point across to the majority of the electorate, which is still looking at gas prices as if that's the issue. It's much more than that at this point. It's a civilizational survival question.
Since the Paris Agreement has come out, which we supported at the time it came out and supported it, has been very vocal in our support since then.
Big Oil used to pretend that climate change wasn't real. The new version is to pretend that they're trying to be part of the solution.
Since 2015, Exxon has publicly claimed to support the Paris Agreement, the biggest international commitment to address climate change in history. But the House Oversight and Senate Budget Committee's joint investigation examining more than 2 million pages of documents revealed an almost comical level of corporate doublespeak to evade the agreement.
A 2019 Exxon memo to CEO Darren Woods urged that an industry document remove reference to the Paris Agreement. Why? Because referencing it could create a potential commitment to advocate on the Paris Agreement goals. Here's America's biggest oil company internally at the highest level, avoiding commitment to the Paris Agreement goals they claim to support.
Pledges to achieve net zero, the universally accepted standard for lowering greenhouse gas emissions, are another way big oil co-opts the language of climate action while blocking progress behind the scenes.
Between 2013 and 2018, Shell launched a series of reports with titles straight out of the National Geographic: Sky, Mountains, Oceans, that touted an ambitious plan for the world to achieve net zero. But in a 2020 internal presentation sharing approved messages on net zero emissions, the Shell government relations team carefully instructed lobbyists and employees that they, quote, should not imply or suggest it's a Shell target.
In 2009, Exxon announced a program promoting algae as a new biofuel source that could reduce emissions and launched a massive ad blitz.
Some farms grow food. This one grows fuel.
A series of these ads aired 10,000 times and garnered over 3.7 billion impressions. Exxon spent approximately $175 million on the ad campaign and $350 million on the algae research.
You got that right. Exxon spent half as much on the ads about the research as they did doing the research, and they could have used all that PR money because the research they did do never yielded anything. In one internal 2017 email exchange on this ad blitz, an Exxon research and development executive cautioned that they, quote, need to be mindful that we're not suggesting it's ready to go to large-scale demo.
After all that publicity, Exxon canceled its algae program in 2023.
Big Oil also loves to celebrate natural gas. Since the early 2000s, the oil industry has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into advertising natural gas as a clean and green energy solution.
Liquefied natural gas. It's like tiny, powerful wizards that emit far less CO2 than some other wizards.
There's just one problem. Natural gas isn't clean and it's not green. The main component of natural gas is methane, a greenhouse gas more potent and climate destructive than CO2 due to methane leaks. Some scientists believe natural gas is as harmful to the climate as coal, and Big Oil knows it. In one 2019 email exchange uncovered in our investigation, a BP lobbyist forwarded colleagues an MIT study showing that methane emissions from natural gas offset any climate benefits, adding, quote, this is an issue that will not go away.
Fossil fuel companies want to disguise natural gas as renewable to lock their fossil fuels into our energy future. But don't take it from us, take it from them. Internal BP documents show that ensuring a future for natural gas was their goal. They wanted to, quote, advance and protect the role of gas and BP in the future of the energy conversation by continuing to contrast gas as a low-carbon alternative to coal, harnessing the excitement around renewables by positioning gas as the perfect partner, and highlighting the role of gas as a friend to renewables.
Another internal document advises natural gas should be, quote, a bridge fuel in a low-carbon transition and a destination fuel for the long term. That's right, an endless bridge to the land of the carbon kings, where America stays dependent on their polluting products for eternity or until the final climate disaster.
Oil and gas companies claim to support climate policies, but then they use their trade associations to lobby for the opposite. One former Exxon lobbyist was actually caught on tape describing how Exxon uses the American Petroleum Institute, or API, to take the heat for them in Congress.
It's getting our associations to step in and have those conversations and answer those tough questions and be the for lack of a better term, the whipping boy for some of these members of Congress.
Like in 2019, when the Trump administration announced plans to roll back regulations on the greenhouse gas methane. Publicly, even Shell, Exxon, and BP came out against this rollback announcement.
But a witness from API confirmed that the lobbying group, paid by those companies, lobbied for the methane rule rollback. The August proposal by EPA you publicly supported, correct?
Correct.
In a 2019 internal email, a BP employee confirmed that rolling back methane emissions regulations was, quote, aligned with our thinking. And with API's urging, the Trump administration indeed rolled back the methane regs.
If you think these episodes are bad, imagine what we might have found if these companies had not completely obstructed the committee's investigation. Several thousand documents that the companies produced were substantially redacted to obscure clearly relevant and potentially critical information, or they were just withheld outright.
So what we've shown you today barely scratches the surface. A complete record is needed to understand the full scope of Big Oil's disinformation campaign. Big Oil executives constantly ask for a seat at the table on climate change policy.
Having a seat at the table, and whether indeed companies like BP actually need to be at the table, I believe, to help the world make this transition.
We've got a seat at the table and we're contributing.
There's no one company, there's no one industry, there's no one country that has all the answers to this. We want to be a part of that.
And that's going to take collaboration by companies like Shell. Working together is the only way we're going to reach net zero by 2050.
Despite their claims, our landmark investigation shows what they've actually done with their seat at the table. They want to own the whole house and keep everyone else in the dark. Lies, deceit, doublespeak, and obstruction, anything to prevent meaningful action on climate change. So now we're beyond begging for a seat at their table on their property. It's time for America to hold Big Oil accountable.
Right. Time to hold Big Oil accountable. Every mature adult is responsible for the predictable consequences of their own actions. So are corporations. The only exceptions are those who are temporarily or criminally insane. Action is required, as these gentlemen have made clear.
So here we are, right across the lawn from the Supreme Court, whose capture was effected by fossil fuel billionaires. Leonard Leo, who packed that court, was funded by fossil fuel billionaires. And they got their money's worth because that court stopped climate progress over and over again, saving the fossil fuel industry hundreds of billions of dollars in cleanup. But that wasn't all that court did for the fossil fuel industry. It also whittled down the ability of prosecutors to make cases of corruption. It used to be, when I was making these cases, that you would trust a jury to decide what was improper corruption. This court took away that ability of American jurors to make that decision, and instead they narrowed it down to a specific, exact quid pro quo. So it has been very hard to investigate and prosecute the fossil fuel industry for its efforts corrupting that building. And then comes Donald Trump, and he has a private meeting with Big Oil execs, and he says to them in that private meeting, give me $1 billion quid, and I will give you quo. All the fossil fuel helping rollbacks that we can provide. He actually had a list. At the same time, Big Oil folks are writing his executive orders for him in anticipation of him being elected. There is a real stink of corruption, and with respect to this episode, it hits the quid pro quo barrier. So Chairman Wyden and the Finance Committee and I have written to all of the companies present at that meeting, demanding answers, information, documents about what took place, about what led up to it, about what the context is for that quid pro quo corrupt offer. And just yesterday, my House friend's wonderful colleague Jamie Raskin and I held a press conference to announce that our investigation about Big Oil's fraud had gotten to the point where we were formally referring the matter to the Department of Justice to do the same kind of investigation that they did of Big Tobacco, which, by the way, they won. So we have got to reel in the corruption of big oil. This quid pro quo offer gives us a hell of a good reason to pursue it. And thank you very much to LCV and to Climate Power for all of their support in these efforts.
It's called Criminal Deception Global Guilt. Have a look. It's really quite extraordinary when you look at the different patterns that are emerging. Take a look, for example, at the climate implications of what's happening at this point. We're in real trouble here, and the agencies that look into the global climate are making this very clear. Take a look.
Playing out a significant role. The key to
Well, new today, NOAA has joined the ranks of Colorado State University and the weather company by releasing its seasonal forecast for the Atlantic hurricane season. And like CSU, NOAA's is also the most aggressive and extreme forecast they've ever issued this early in the season.
This season is looking to be an extraordinary one in a number of ways, based on our data and models with the El Nino-La Nina playing out a significant role. The key this year, as in any year, is to get prepared and stay prepared. We're going to be emphasizing that throughout these comments. It's the best way to reduce risk.
All right, so the numbers, they're high. The range is 17 to 25, the most they've ever forecast. Hurricanes 8 to 13, major hurricanes 4 to 7. Again, falling pretty much in line with what the other large entities have done. And this is, again, their most aggressive forecast since they started issuing them in 1999.
And so, Dr. Knabb, our hurricane expert, want to bring you in to talk about this. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the warm ocean temperatures and La Nina. Anything else going on that's making for such robust numbers? Or are we just so confident in those two factors?
Those are the general factors. But when you dig into what is going on in the Atlantic Ocean, sea surface temperatures being at record levels, that's also associated with weaker than usual trade winds that aren't churning up the cooler waters from below. And you add that to the lesser upper level westerly winds that you get in El Nino years, that's going away. We are just weakening the wind shear over places like the Caribbean where we didn't have any hurricanes and major hurricanes last year. I think that could be the biggest difference this year, is that the Caribbean freight train of hurricanes turns back on. And you look back to 2020, you look back to 2005, even 2021, Ian in 22. It's the stuff that forms it comes through and forms in the Western Caribbean that comes up toward the continental U.S. Those are the big, bad hurricane seasons.
When do we expect the season to start getting going? I look back to like a 2005. That season started off very fast, right? We have a major hurricane even in early July, right, with Dennis that made landfall. Mm-hmm. Would you expect the season to start early then as a result of all the factors you just listed?
I don't see why it couldn't, be given that the sea surface temperatures right now are like into the late part of July and into August, almost peak of season sea surface temperatures. And El Nino will go to neutral and then likely go to La Nina in the peak of the season. So the conditions will, I think, get conducive for hurricanes and major hurricanes a little earlier than usual. Now, you still often, even in 2005, there was a relative downturn for a little bit in late July, early August, and then it ramped back up.
Well, this is very serious indeed. And in fact, the country's not prepared for it. The country isn't prepared for whatever's coming at this point because we're preoccupied with looking at other things. That should change because of these reports and the forecasts from the scientists. We are, in effect, in new territory and new challenges for government to take over from the fossil fuel industries that have touted one thing, but in fact go on and do the same old, and abandoned their quote-unquote solutions, including green algae. And the lies of the fossil fuel companies are being compounded by corrupt politicians seeking office at any cost. Any cost. This is what's coming from a former president who had a secret dinner with fossil fuel executives in Mar-a-Lago and asked for $1 billion to support his campaign. Could climate policy be up for sale? Well, that's a silly understatement. It has been up for sale for decades, and it's been bought. He looks to big oil, and we will all pay the consequences. Scientists have been predicting these things for over 35 years, 36 years. In fact, James Hansen got before the Senate in June of 1988 and made it clear what was at stake. Academic studies have underscored the way ExxonMobil has misled the public. People like James Gustav Speth have made this case as well, former dean of the Yale Environment School of Environmental Studies at Yale University. And now the reports are coming out predicting worse than ever, worse than on any record, a hurricane season coming up. Keep an eye on what's happening and keep in touch.